I want to start with immigration today because we're continuing to follow the immigration situation at the U.S. Mexico border. You may well know that Donald Trump's presidency saw some horrible things happen from the standpoint of immigration, including the scaling up of the separation of immigrant children from their parents, scaling up of specific types of deportations, although deportations were actually quite high under Barack Obama. No progress whatsoever on some kind of permanent status for DACA, the Dreamer recipients. The list goes on, and we've talked about that. And as Joe Biden's domestic policy during his first 100 days has been widely successful, empirically popular with the American people, including even with many Republicans and right-wing media have had to come up with something that will register as a pseudo scandal for Joe Biden and criticisms of him other than simply he's a socialist that might resonate with the American people. And one such criticism, one such area has been immigration, despite the almost painful double standard for us, right? I mean, the right doesn't understand double standards or they're not affected by them anymore. But despite what for us has been an almost painful double standard of them starting to pretend to care about the kids at the border the day that Joe Biden becomes president, while they said nothing about it when Donald Trump was president of the United States, they have been pushing this crisis at the border story. And to some degree, it has worked. The number of Americans who believe that the immigration situation is a top issue has almost doubled from June. I think it was about 28% of Americans believed it was an emergency situation in June. Now 48% do. They've also included in this pseudo scandal the numbers of increased border crossings, during the first part of the year. And as we previously talked about, that's very deceptive because there's a big seasonality to border crossings in the first quarter of the year, particularly in February and March. Every year, border crossings go up. This year in particular, we not only saw that for seasonal reasons, but there's also been this pent up demand from people who would have tried to cross at some time in 2020, and they did not because of the pandemic. Movement was just dramatically reduced during the pandemic. So we talked about the kind of seasonality of that and why just looking at that change month to month doesn't really tell us everything we need to know. Now there's a real new problem for Republicans pushing this, and that's that the number of unaccompanied migrant children that are being held in these jail-like conditions by Customs and Border Patrol, the number is down 84% in the span of just a month. As of Wednesday, there were 954 children remaining in these Border Patrol facilities. That's down from nearly 6,000 on March 28th. That's an incredible decline per officials speaking to CNN. The average time that kids are now in Border Patrol custody is down to 28 hours. It was 133 hours on March 28th. That is nearly an 80% reduction in how long each of these kids is spending with Border Patrol. Now, this may actually be part of why you've been hearing less about this from Republicans for the last 10 to 14 days. It's not that they care about the facts. They've just decided to ignore the topic because of these numbers. And to be fair, they've been distracted with some other things as well. Now, I'm going to be consistent. How could I honestly say 3 minutes ago, some of this fluctuation is seasonal, and now say this is down only because of Joe Biden? No. There is likely some seasonality here as well as to why we saw the number of children decline in April versus March. But part of this is because Joe Biden actually made it a priority to resolve more of these cases more quickly and to get the numbers down. Now, the big picture is that this changes almost nothing about the urgency of finding a permanent solution to the immigration situation. DACA needs to be dealt with. It's long overdue. There needs to be a permanent solution for those under the DACA program. But the point here is that even the acute numbers that Republicans are now cynically pointing to, remember, during the Trump administration, they didn't care about these children at the border. The numbers Republicans are now cynically pointing to in order to attack Joe Biden are now looking increasingly better and better. So how will right-wing media and Republicans react? There's a few possibilities. Part one is they may do what they've been doing the last 10 to 14 days, which is they may just stop talking about it. Reminds me of the Ebola situation in 2014. leading up, Barack Obama reelected in 2012. Then we had the campaign for the midterms of 2014. Leading up to the midterms in November of 2014, it was day after day after day of Ebola, Ebola, Ebola. Obama's handling Ebola terribly. Remember, 2 people died in the U.S. I think none of those 2 people even contracted it in the U.S. It was just hammering on Ebola. And I said at the time, not an incredibly astute predict, didn't take much skill to predict. I said, this is politically motivated. After the election, there's going to be no more talk of this. And after the midterms, there was no more talk of Ebola. Contrast that with Trump saying no one's going to talk about COVID if I lose in November and the election's over. And of course, that was not the case because it was a real problem actually mishandled by Trump. In any case, that may be one approach from Republicans, which is now that the number of kids at the border is down 84%, just don't talk about it. Second option is they may just lie and talk about it as if the numbers don't exist or aren't available. Just continue saying the same thing. They might go with, unfortunately, Biden has still left almost 1,000 kids at the border facilities, ignoring that number is down 84%. They may just be more vague and say there are still kids being held by Joe Biden or something. That may be one thing. You may see headlines like Biden administration continues child detention program that was initiated by Barack Obama. That'd be like a beautiful Fox News headline that ignores what happened in the 4 years intervening. But truly, while knowing that this is just one part of the immigration problem, it is really difficult to change anything quickly when the American federal government is involved. It's a country of 331 million people. That's why the Biden vaccination program has been so notable. That's why reducing these numbers of kids at the border by 84% in a month, there's a seasonality, but it still is an accomplishment and a legitimate one at that. We'll see how Republicans react to it. One of our sponsors is Magic Spoon, the breakfast cereal that tastes just like the sugary, tasty cereals we all loved as kids, but without the sugar and without the carbs. Magic Spoon is sweet and delicious with 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net carbs, making it perfect for a low carb or keto diet. And very exciting news, Magic Spoon has released an awesome new flavor, birthday cake, available for a limited time only, but you can still get cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, and cinnamon. You can build your own variety pack. Our team has tried every flavor. We've looked at each flavor really strongly, and we keep asking them to just send us more. You'll get $5 off when you go to magicspoon.com/Pakman and use the coupon code Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video.